An experienced hiker and her loyal dog vanished in the rugged Montana wilderness during a severe storm. For 6 years, officials believed she had been swept away by a river, a theory her fiancé vehemently rejected. That belief was shattered when a state contractor, inspecting a derelict cabin miles away, pried open its sealed chimney, revealing the first piece of a much darker truth. The expected call never came. By September 12, 2009, a gnawing fear had begun to curdle for Owen Vance. His fiancée, 27-year-old Kalin Quaid, was now 24 hours overdue from a scheduled 4-day solo hike. This wasn't a simple case of losing track of time. Kalin adhered strictly to their safety protocols, including regular check-ins via satellite messenger. When the designated time passed without a signal, Owen initially rationalized it. Maybe the device had malfunctioned or she was in a dead zone. But as the hours stretched on, the rationalizations wore thin. Kalin Quaid was no novice. She and Owen had been inseparable since high school, their relationship forged over miles of trails and a shared passion for the rugged Montana outdoors. They were planning their wedding, mapping out a future filled with children and decades more of exploration. The trip Kalin embarked on was meant to be a reset. She had just finished a stressful week at work and sought the solitude that only the deep wilderness could provide. It was a common practice for her. Owen couldn't join her due to his own commitments, so she had gone alone, accompanied only by Baron, her massive, loyal Bernese Mountain Dog. Owen tried the satellite messenger again. Still nothing. The anxiety now felt like a physical weight in his chest. He knew the route she had planned, a challenging loop in a remote section of the mountains, an area they both knew well but that still demanded respect. He couldn't wait any longer. Owen drove the hours to the remote trailhead, the winding roads familiar yet menacing under the circumstances. When he arrived, he found Kalin's vehicle parked exactly where she said she would leave it. It was undisturbed, offering no clues, no notes left behind. The emptiness of the parking area, surrounded by the dense, indifferent forest, amplified his isolation. He called her name, the sound swallowed by the vast landscape. Only the wind responded. Returning to the nearest town with reliable cell service, Owen contacted the local sheriff's department. He provided the dispatcher with all the necessary details, emphasizing her experience, but also her uncharacteristic silence. He described her gear in detail, hoping something might stand out. He told them to look for a bright turquoise windbreaker, a red hiking backpack, and Baron, who always wore a bright orange bandana around his neck. To help the searchers visualize who they were looking for, Owen provided a recent photograph he had taken himself just weeks prior. The photo showed Kalin kneeling on a mossy rock, her light brown hair catching the sunlight, smiling warmly as she cradled Baron's head. It captured her vitality, her connection to the environment, and her bond with the dog. Owen also informed the authorities of one other crucial detail: Kalin was armed. She routinely carried a handgun for protection against the apex predators that roamed the area, grizzlies and mountain lions. The official missing person report was filed immediately. Given the terrain and the potential dangers involved, the sheriff's department didn't impose a waiting period. By nightfall on September 12th, the machinery of a large-scale search and rescue operation was beginning to mobilize. For Owen Vance, the agonizing wait had just begun, centered on a single terrifying question: what could have possibly happened to silence someone as capable as Kalin? As dawn broke on September 13th, 2009, the search for Kalin Quaid began in earnest. The scale of the operation reflected the urgency of the situation and the vastness of the terrain. The Montana wilderness is unforgiving, characterized by steep elevation changes, dense forests, and unpredictable weather. The area Kalin had chosen for her hike was particularly remote, demanding specialized teams and resources. Helicopters were deployed, their rotors thrumming against the mountain silence as they crisscrossed the airspace above her planned route. The aerial search was methodical, utilizing grid patterns and thermal imaging technology, hoping to detect any sign of human presence: a campfire, a flash of color, a heat signature. On the ground, specialized search and rescue teams, including K-9 units and experienced trackers, began the meticulous process of combing the trails. The terrain was rugged and progress was slow. Every overturned rock and dense thicket had to be examined. Owen Vance was there every day, volunteering alongside the professionals, driven by a desperate need to bring Kalin home. He provided intricate details about her hiking habits, her preferred campsites, and her likely reactions to specific challenges. He walked the trails with the search teams, his eyes scanning the landscape, hoping for a familiar sight, dreading what they might find. The exhaustion was evident in his face, but his resolve was unwavering. Yet, from the very beginning, the search was plagued by a baffling absence of evidence. Investigators found this deeply unsettling. Kalin was wearing bright colors. The turquoise jacket and red backpack were chosen specifically to be visible in a dense green environment. Baron, with his distinctive coat and vivid orange bandana, should also have been easy to spot from the air. They expected to find something: a dropped water bottle, a piece of gear, a footprint, even signs of a struggle. But the wilderness yielded nothing. The trails remained pristine, the forest floor undisturbed. It was as if she and the dog had simply evaporated. The initial theories focused on the most common dangers of the backcountry. Had she fallen from a ridge? Trackers examined the base of cliffs along her route, rappelling into ravines and canyons, finding no signs of disturbed earth or vegetation. Had she been attacked by wildlife? Kalin carried a handgun for this very reason, and Baron was a formidable deterrent. Investigators looked for signs of an animal encounter, blood trails, scattered gear, drag marks, but found none. The investigation soon had to contend with a significant environmental factor. A severe, unexpected weather system had swept through the region during the time Kalin was hiking. What started as a mild autumn day had rapidly deteriorated into a torrential downpour with high winds and dropping temperatures. This storm became the centerpiece of the investigation, offering a plausible explanation for her disappearance. The sudden onset of the storm could have forced her off the trail, seeking immediate shelter, potentially leading to disorientation or hypothermia. It was during a sweep of an area miles off Kalin's planned route that searchers finally found a clue. The discovery came after days of fruitless searching, a moment of sudden focus in the vast expanse of the wilderness. Near the banks of a fast-moving river swollen by the recent rains, trackers identified a set of human footprints accompanied by large dog tracks. The discovery energized the search effort, providing the first tangible evidence of Kalin's movements. The tracks were distinct enough to suggest they belonged to Kalin and Baron, but their location and nature were alarming. The footprints suggested someone moving urgently, perhaps running, heading directly toward a notoriously dangerous crossing point on the river. This wasn't a designated trail, it was a shortcut, a desperate attempt to navigate back toward civilization. The terrain was steep, the footing treacherous. The tracks led right to the water's edge, where the churning, icy water erased any further sign. The discovery galvanized the search effort, shifting the focus to the river system. Dive teams were brought in, navigating the treacherous currents, probing the depths of the murky water. Ground teams scoured the banks downstream for miles, searching for any sign of Kalin or Baron, any piece of gear that might have washed ashore. The working theory began to solidify in the minds of the investigators. Kalin had likely been caught in the severe weather and, in a state of confusion, abandoned her planned route and attempted the shortcut. Trying to cross the river during high water, she was swept away. Baron, loyal to the end, likely followed her into the water. The sheer force of the swollen river could easily explain the complete lack of evidence found downstream. It was a powerful, indiscriminate force capable of erasing all traces of human presence, a scenario that made sense given the available evidence. Owen Vance, however, vehemently rejected this theory. He insisted to investigators that Kalin was too experienced, too level-headed to make such a catastrophic mistake. He argued she knew the dangers of that river and would never attempt a crossing during a storm. She would have hunkered down, set up her tent, and waited for the weather to pass. But Owen's insistence was rooted in his knowledge of Kalin, while the investigators were bound by the physical evidence found at the riverbank. The tracks leading to the water's edge were the only concrete clue they had. As the weeks dragged on, the search continued, but the intensity gradually decreased. The resources dedicated to the operation were finite, and the likelihood of finding Kalin alive diminished with every passing day. The weather turned colder, and the first snows began to dust the higher elevations, making the search conditions increasingly hazardous. By the onset of winter in late 2009, the active search for Kalin Quaid was officially scaled back. The lack of definitive proof meant the case remained open, but in practice it went cold. The wilderness held its secrets tightly. For the authorities, the most likely scenario remained an accidental drowning. For Owen Vance, the void left by Kalin's disappearance was absolute, a devastating absence marked by unanswered questions and the refusal to accept that the mountains they loved had simply taken her away. The story of Kalin Quaid became another cautionary tale of the Montana backcountry, a mystery submerged in the cold waters of a mountain river. 6 years passed. The disappearance of Kalin Quaid had become a distant memory, a forgotten cold case filed away in the archives. For her friend, Owen Vance, the lack of closure was a constant ache, a shadow over the life he'd struggled to rebuild. The vast wilderness where she vanished remained unchanged, indifferent to the mystery it held. The scene shifts to June 2015, to a remote corner of the Montana backcountry. This wasn't far from where the initial search for Kalin had taken place years before, but it was in an area of the wilderness dotted with old, public-use cabins, structures dating back to a different era, minimally maintained by the state. Many had fallen into disrepair and were more of a hazard than a refuge. Garrett Nolan, a state contractor, was part of a small crew with an unusual assignment: to demolish several of these unsound cabins before the approaching fire season. It was a tedious, bureaucratic job involving heavy equipment and long hours in isolated locations. Nolan's specific role was to perform a final inspection of each structure before demolition began. He needed to ensure they were clear of debris, hazardous materials, and most importantly, any trapped wildlife. Animals often sought shelter in these abandoned buildings, and protocol required a thorough check to prevent them from being harmed. Nolan's last stop was one of the most isolated cabins on the list. It sat in a small clearing, its wood weathered gray by years of sun and rain. The door was slightly ajar, the interior dusty and neglected. Nolan began his inspection with the practiced diligence of a veteran contractor. He checked the perimeter, then the interior, finding nothing but dust and debris. The final step was to inspect the chimney. He grabbed a ladder from his truck, propped it against the cabin, and climbed onto the weathered roof. The view was breathtaking, a panorama of rolling hills and dense forest that emphasized the profound isolation of his location. As he moved toward the brick chimney stack, he immediately noticed something odd. It was capped. A heavy, square metal lid was rusted tightly over the opening. Caps weren't unusual, as they kept out rain and snow, but this one seemed deliberately sealed, fused to the brickwork by years of rust. Nolan retrieved a pry bar and began to work on the lid. The metal screeched in protest as the seal broke. With a final heave, the lid came free, revealing a dark, square opening. An unsettling, musty odor wafted up from the darkness. Nolan leaned over the opening and peered down. What he saw in that moment made his breath catch. It wasn't a bird's nest or a squirrel. Wedged vertically inside the narrow chimney shaft were the mummified remains of a large dog. The sight was profoundly disturbing, surreal in its horror. The body was desiccated, a dark, leathery brown-black. The dog was positioned upright, its front paws braced against the brick walls as if it had been trying to claw its way out. The most chilling detail was its face, tilted upward, frozen in a final, agonizing posture. Its lips were pulled back in a grotesque grimace, revealing a full set of white teeth in a silent bark of terror. Reeling from the discovery, Nolan stumbled back across the roof, his heart pounding. This was no accident. The dog's position, the desperate struggle to escape, and the sealed chimney cap all pointed to a deliberate, cruel act. He immediately descended the ladder, his hands shaking, and radioed his supervisor. The demolition was halted, and given the disturbing nature of the find, authorities were called to the scene. The investigation was initially classified as a case of extreme, sadistic animal cruelty. The extraction of the remains from the chimney was a grim, delicate process. Investigators had to meticulously dismantle a section of the chimney brick by brick to access the fragile, mummified body. The remains were then transported to a veterinary forensics lab for a detailed necropsy. At this point, the investigators believed the case was an isolated incident, unrelated to anything else. The priority was to determine the cause of death and identify the animal, hoping it would lead them to the owner. The necropsy confirmed Nolan's observations. The dog was a large Bernese Mountain Dog. The state of preservation was remarkable, a result of the dry conditions inside the chimney. The cause of death was determined quickly, and the findings were deeply disturbing. The necropsy revealed evidence of severe heat exposure and significant smoke inhalation. The animal had been alive when a fire was burning in the fireplace below, attempting to escape the rising heat and smoke by climbing up the chimney shaft. The sealed cap had ensured there was no escape, leading to a slow, agonizing death. The cruelty was staggering, but the central question remained: who was this dog? And how did it end up in such a horrific situation? A scan for a microchip yielded no results. Without a way to identify the dog, the trail went cold. The remote location and the apparent age of the remains made it unlikely that anyone would come forward to claim the animal. The case seemed destined to remain unsolved. In a last-ditch effort, evidence photos of the remains were circulated among regional veterinary specialists and breed-specific organizations. The hope was that someone might recognize the dog. It was a long shot, but it was this routine step that caught the attention of Drive West, a respected veterinarian specializing in large breeds. As she studied the photographs, a subtle detail in the dog's front paws caught her eye. It was a rare congenital deformity, a slight rotation of the metacarpals that resulted in a distinctive gait. Drive West realized she had seen this exact condition before. In her decades of practice, she had treated only one dog with this specific deformity in the region, a Bernese Mountain Dog. The rarity of the condition made it a potential identifier as unique as a fingerprint. Driven by this realization, Drive West began the arduous process of retrieving her old patient records. The clinic had transitioned to digital files, but the case she remembered predated the change. She had to sift through years of paper files stored in a dusty back room. After several days, she found it. The file contained detailed notes and X-rays confirming the congenital deformity. The patient's name was Baron. The owner was Kalin Quaid. The name instantly resonated. Drive West remembered the high-profile disappearance of Kalin Quaid 6 years earlier. The timing aligned perfectly with the disappearance in 2009. Drive West immediately contacted the investigators, presenting her findings. The wilderness, it seemed, was finally ready to reveal one of its dark secrets. The connection was immediate and profound. The discovery of a mummified dog inside a chimney instantly transformed the investigation. What began as a disturbing case of animal cruelty was now the first significant break in a high-priority cold case. The implications were staggering. Kalin Quaid hadn't drowned in the river, as the prevailing theory suggested. She had made it to this remote cabin, far from where the search had been concentrated. The timeline aligned perfectly. Kalin disappeared during a severe storm in September 2009. It was plausible she had sought shelter in the public-use cabin when the weather turned dangerous. Investigators immediately reopened Kalin Quaid's case file, reviewing the details provided by Owen Vance, including a photograph of Kalin and her dog, Baron. The image showed Baron wearing a bright orange bandana. Looking back at the evidence photos of the mummified remains, investigators noted a crucial detail. The bandana was absent, with no trace of fabric remnants or burned material around the dog's neck. The discovery of Baron raised a host of new, urgent questions. If the dog was here, where was Kalin? What had happened inside that cabin 6 years ago? And who was responsible for the horrific death of her loyal companion? The mystery deepened, shifting from a tragic accident to something far darker. Owen Vance was notified of the discovery. The news reopened wounds that had never truly healed, confirming his long-held belief that Kalin's disappearance was not an accident. The remote cabin, once overlooked as a dilapidated structure slated for demolition, was now the epicenter of a renewed investigation. The identification of Baron changed everything. It established a definitive location for Kalin Quaid during the time of her disappearance, shattering the long-held theory of accidental drowning. The focus shifted entirely to the cabin, now treated as a critical crime scene. The challenges facing investigators were significant. 6 years had passed since Kalin vanished. The cabin was a public-use structure, accessible to anyone traveling through the backcountry. In the intervening years, countless hunters, hikers, and drifters had likely used the cabin, contaminating the scene and potentially destroying crucial evidence. The task of isolating evidence from 2009 seemed nearly impossible. The forensic team faced the daunting task of peeling back the layers of time, searching for ghosts in a contaminated environment. The first step was to try and reconstruct the timeline of the cabin's usage. Public-use cabins typically maintained a logbook where visitors were encouraged to record their stay. Investigators searched the cabin for the logbook, hoping it might provide a record of who was present during the time of Kalin's disappearance. But the search yielded a frustrating dead end. The logbook covering the period of 2009 was missing. Whether it had been destroyed, lost, or deliberately removed was unknown, but its absence suggested a potential attempt to conceal the identities of those present. If the perpetrator had removed the logbook, it indicated a level of premeditation and awareness of investigative procedures. The investigative team began a meticulous grid-by-grid search of the cabin and the surrounding area. Every floorboard was lifted, every piece of debris examined. The search was exhaustive, utilizing advanced forensic techniques to detect trace evidence that might have survived the passage of time. They used luminol to search for bloodstains, hoping to find evidence of a struggle, but the results were inconclusive. The chemical reacted to years of accumulated grime and the presence of animal blood from hunters using the cabin. The search extended to the exterior of the cabin, focusing on areas where evidence might have been discarded or hidden. The surrounding woods were searched for any sign of a clandestine grave, but the vastness of the area made this a near impossible task. It was during the search of the narrow dirt crawl space underneath the cabin that the next major breakthrough occurred. The crawl space was cramped and dark, accessible only by crawling through a small opening in the foundation. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. A forensic technician sweeping the area with a high-powered flashlight spotted an object tucked away in the farthest corner, partially buried in the dirt. It was a flash of color that didn't belong in the otherwise drab environment. The object was carefully extracted. It was a backpack. The color was faded, the material coated in dust and grime, but the distinctive design was immediately recognizable. It was Kalin Quaid's red hiking backpack, the same one visible in the photograph provided by Owen Vance. The discovery was electrifying. It confirmed beyond any doubt that Kalin had been inside the cabin. The location of the backpack, hidden deep in the crawl space, suggested deliberate concealment. It was clear that someone had attempted to erase any trace of her presence. The backpack was not discarded casually. It was hidden with intent. The backpack was transported to the crime lab for detailed analysis. The contents were meticulously inventoried. Inside, investigators found standard hiking gear, a water bottle, food wrappers, a first aid kit, and a map of the area. The items painted a picture of Kalin's preparedness and routine organization. But it was what was missing that was most significant. Kalin's handgun, which Owen had confirmed she carried for protection, was gone. And the bright orange bandana that Baron wore around his neck was also missing. The absence of the handgun and the bandana confirmed the investigators' growing suspicion. Kalin Quaid had been the victim of foul play. The scenario was becoming clearer. Kalin had sought shelter in the cabin during the storm. Someone else was there, and that someone had taken her weapon and concealed her belongings. The missing handgun suggested she had been disarmed or that the perpetrator had taken the weapon as a trophy or to prevent its discovery. With the confirmation of foul play, the investigation intensified, focusing on the fireplace. This was the site of Baron's agonizing death. The extreme cruelty inflicted on the dog suggested a specific, disturbing motive. Investigators believed that understanding the circumstances of the dog's death might provide insights into the perpetrator's mindset. The act of burning the dog alive in the chimney was so extreme and sadistic that it indicated a level of depravity far beyond a typical homicide. The fireplace was examined with forensic precision. The hearth was swept for trace evidence, and the ashes were analyzed for accelerants or any other unusual substances. The initial examination yielded little beyond the evidence of a wood fire, but the investigators were convinced there was more to be found. The structure of the fireplace itself was scrutinized, every brick and mortar joint examined for anomalies. It was during a deep structural analysis that a technician made a discovery that would shift the entire tone of the investigation. The technician was lying inside the hearth, looking upwards into the chimney shaft, attempting to get a different perspective on the interior structure. His flashlight swept across the heavy wooden mantelpiece that protruded above the fireplace opening. The underside of the mantel was rough, coated in soot, and hidden from casual view. On the underside of the mantelpiece, he discovered something unexpected: subtle geometric carvings etched into the wood. The carvings were precise, intricate, and unsettling. They were not the typical graffiti found in public cabins, like initials carved by bored hunters or crude drawings. These were deliberate, methodical patterns, clearly intended to convey meaning. The location, hidden from view, suggested they were not meant for public display, but rather as a private signature or a ritualistic marking. The carvings were documented and analyzed by specialists. They did not match any known indigenous symbols or common gang insignia. The patterns were complex, suggesting a symbolic language. Consultation with experts on fringe religious and ideological groups suggested potential links to dark occult practices. The symbols seemed to draw from esoteric traditions blended with personalized elements. The discovery of the carvings introduced a new, terrifying dimension to the case. The evidence pointed toward a methodical, ritualistic intent. The disappearance of Kalin Quaid was no longer just a case of foul play. It appeared to be something far more sinister. The isolation of the cabin, the horrific death of the dog, and the presence of the ritualistic symbols all suggested a perpetrator with a deeply disturbed worldview. The investigation was now hunting for someone operating far outside the bounds of conventional criminal behavior. The secrets held within the cabin were proving to be darker than anyone could have imagined, leading the investigation down a path few were prepared to travel. The discovery of the carvings beneath the mantelpiece became the central focus of the investigation. These symbols represented the only unique signature left by whoever was in the cabin with Kalin Quaid. In the absence of DNA evidence or witnesses, the carvings were the most tangible link to the perpetrator. The investigation hinged on identifying the origin and meaning of these intricate designs. Investigators digitized the intricate patterns and began an exhaustive search through databases of known occult and fringe group symbology. The assumption was that these carvings were related to a recognized belief system, perhaps a sect operating in the remote regions of Montana. But the search yielded frustrating dead ends. The symbols did not match any established iconography. Consultation with experts on the occult resulted in theories and speculation, but no definitive identification. The experts suggested the symbols might be rooted in satanic practices, but the specific patterns were unique. The symbols appeared to be highly personalized, perhaps specific to an extremely small, localized sect, or even the creation of an individual operating under a unique ideology. This realization presented a significant challenge. If the symbols were unique to the perpetrator, they would be unrecognizable in any standard context. The investigation was stalled by the esoteric nature of the evidence. Faced with this impasse, the investigators decided to broaden their approach. They recognized that the carvings, while potentially symbolic, were also a form of craftsmanship. The precision and intricacy of the designs suggested a practiced hand, someone comfortable working with tools and materials. They theorized that if the perpetrator had carved these symbols in the cabin, they might have replicated the design elsewhere, perhaps in their home, their vehicle, or in other personal belongings. The design was so specific, so deliberate, that it likely held deep personal significance for the individuals involved. The decision was made to circulate detailed images of the carvings beyond the confines of law enforcement. The images were sent to local historians and anthropologists, hoping the symbols might have roots in unrecognized local traditions. But crucially, the images were also circulated among regional artisans and craftspeople. This included woodworkers, leather workers, tattoo artists, and metal workers. The hope was that someone might recognize the design not as a symbol, but as a pattern they had encountered or perhaps even created. It was a long shot, a creative approach born out of desperation. The images circulated for weeks without generating any significant leads. The investigators continued to pursue other angles, attempting to trace the origins of the missing handgun through back channels and analyzing the degraded DNA evidence found in the cabin. But the results were inconclusive. The trail seemed to be growing cold again. Then a call came in from a specialized metal worker operating a forge in a nearby county. His name was Quinn Isaacs. He had seen the images of the carving circulated in a regional artisan newsletter. He reported that he immediately recognized the pattern. It was not a recognized symbol, he confirmed, but a custom design. Isaacs's statement was met with cautious optimism by the investigators. They arranged an immediate interview. Isaacs, a meticulous craftsman known for his high-end custom metalwork, provided the breakthrough the investigation desperately needed. He operated a small, specialized forge, focusing on unique architectural elements for discerning clients. He reported that in late 2008, he had been commissioned to create an extensive set of custom metalwork featuring that exact geometric design. The commission was large and complex, involving the creation of large gates, structural fixtures, and decorative elements for a remote property. The design was unique, specified by the clients, and required intricate forging techniques. Isaac still had the original sketches and invoices from the project. He retrieved them from his archives, laying them out for the investigators. The match was undeniable. The sketches depicted the exact pattern found carved on the cabin mantelpiece. He described the design process, recalling that the clients were very specific about the pattern, insisting on absolute precision in its execution. They were demanding clients, meticulous about every detail of the design. The work had taken several months to complete. Investigators pressed Isaacs for the client details. He provided the information. The commission was for a large, isolated farm owned by two men, Deacon Yardley and Reese Xavier. The names were unfamiliar to the investigators. Yardley and Xavier had no criminal history, no connection to Kalin Quaid, and had never surfaced during the initial investigation in 2009. They were completely off the radar. Investigators began a background check on the two men. Deacon Yardley and Reese Xavier were a couple who owned and operated a large cattle farm in a remote area of Montana. They were known in their small community for being highly reclusive, rarely interacting with neighbors, and maintaining a high degree of privacy on their extensive property. They were viewed as eccentric but harmless. Their isolation was attributed to their desire for privacy. The location of the farm was geographically plausible. It was situated in the same general region as the remote cabin, accessible via the network of logging roads that crisscrossed the wilderness. The next step was to determine if Yardley and Xavier had any connection to the area around the cabin during the time of Kalin's disappearance. Investigators cross-referenced the names against hunting and fishing license databases, confirming that both men held valid permits for the area near the cabin in September 2009. This placed them in the vicinity during the critical time frame. Given the severe storm, it was highly likely they, like Kalin, would have sought shelter in the public cabin. The connection made by Quinn Isaacs became the turning point. The unique symbols, once an enigma, were now a direct link to two individuals who fit the profile: isolated, potentially involved in personalized ritualistic practices, and present in the area during the disappearance. The circumstantial evidence was compelling. The presence of the custom design commissioned by Yardley and Xavier at Kalin Quaid's last known location provided sufficient grounds for a search warrant. The investigation mobilized rapidly, preparing to confront the two men who held the answers to the 6-year-old mystery. The focus shifted from the wilderness to the secluded farm, where the secrets of Kalin's fate were likely hidden. The anticipation was palpable as the investigation moved towards a confrontation with the darkness that had consumed Kalin Quaid. The realization that the unique symbols carved into the cabin's mantle were directly tied to Deacon Yardley and Reese Xavier galvanized the investigation. A search warrant was swiftly secured, and a tactical team was mobilized to execute it on the isolated farm. The property was extensive, surrounded by dense woods, and accessible only by a long private driveway. The reclusive nature of the occupants and the disturbing evidence suggested the potential for resistance. Investigators knew Kalin's handgun was still missing, and the suspects were likely armed. As the tactical team approached the property in the early morning hours of July 2015, the connection established by metalworker Quinn Isaacs was chillingly confirmed. The farm's entrance was marked by large, imposing metal gates forged with the exact geometric design found in the cabin. The prominent, intricate, and unsettling symbols served as a stark declaration of the occupants' worldview. The farm felt like a fortress, isolated and heavily secured. The team secured the property quickly, taking Yardley and Xavier into custody without incident. The two men appeared surprised but remained outwardly calm, almost detached. Their reaction was unsettling, devoid of the panic or anger typically seen during such operations. With the occupants detained, a systematic search of the farm began. The property was vast, containing a main house, several outbuildings, and extensive acreage for cattle farming. The search immediately uncovered disturbing evidence that corroborated the ritualistic elements suggested by the carvings. The main house was sparsely furnished, meticulous yet cold. But in the outbuildings, investigators found a very different scene. One structure, a large barn set back from the main house, appeared to be dedicated entirely to ritualistic practices. Inside, they found altars adorned with the same geometric symbols, evidence of extensive animal sacrifice, including bones and dried blood, and a collection of materials related to satanic practices and personalized occult beliefs. The atmosphere was oppressive, and the evidence pointed to a long-standing, deeply ingrained ideology centered around the symbols they had commissioned. The search continued, focusing on finding evidence directly linking the men to Kalin Quaid's disappearance. The breakthrough came in a locked outbuilding separate from the ritual space, used as a workshop. Inside, hidden in a safe bolted to the floor, investigators located a handgun. A serial number check was conducted immediately. It was a match. It was Kalin Quaid's missing handgun, the weapon she carried for protection in the wilderness. The discovery of the handgun was the definitive piece of physical evidence connecting Yardley and Xavier to the crime. The investigation moved into the interrogation phase. Yardley and Xavier were separated and interrogated simultaneously at the local sheriff's department. The interviews were conducted by experienced detectives trained to deal with complex psychological profiles. Xavier remained silent, refusing to answer any questions. His demeanor was cold and uncooperative. He sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the wall, offering no reaction to the evidence presented against him. He invoked his right to counsel and offered nothing. Deacon Yardley, however, presented a different challenge. He was initially evasive, feigning ignorance about the cabin and Kalin's disappearance. He offered plausible explanations for the symbols, claiming they were merely decorative. But as investigators confronted him with the overwhelming evidence, his composure began to crack. They presented him with photographs of the carvings in the cabin, juxtaposed with images of the metalwork on his farm. They showed him Kalin's handgun, recovered from his property, and described in graphic detail the horrific death of Baron, the dog found mummified in the chimney. The investigators theorized that the extreme cruelty inflicted on the dog was not random, but an act of retaliation. They suggested the dog had likely attacked them, attempting to defend Kalin. As they pressed this theory, they noticed a subtle reaction from Yardley. He subconsciously touched his forearm, a fleeting gesture but enough to draw their attention. They asked Yardley about his arm. He hesitated. When pressed, he reluctantly rolled up his sleeve, revealing extensive, deep scarring covering his forearm. The scars were old, thick, and raised, clearly the result of a severe injury consistent with a large animal attack. The pattern of the scars matched the bite marks of a large dog. He and Xavier were on a hunting trip when the severe storm hit. Recognizing the danger of the deteriorating weather, they sought shelter in the public-use cabin, a familiar location in their hunting territory. Shortly after their arrival, Kalin Quaid and her dog, Baron, arrived, also seeking refuge. The cabin was small, forcing the three of them to share the space. Yardley noted that Kalin was friendly and seemed to trust them. He speculated that she may have felt secure because they presented as a non-threatening gay couple, perceiving them as fellow travelers rather than a danger. They shared the space, the atmosphere initially cordial. After several hours, the storm raging outside, Kalin, exhausted from her hike, eventually fell asleep. Yardley stated that she felt safe enough to pack away her handgun, leaving it inaccessible in her backpack. It was then that Yardley and Xavier made their move. According to Yardley, they viewed Kalin's unexpected arrival as an opportunity, seeing her as a sacrifice for their personalized satanic rituals. While she slept, they attacked her, strangling her to death. The act was methodical, ritualistic, fulfilling a dark imperative of their belief system. The attack was sudden and violent, but they hadn't accounted for Baron. The dog, loyal and protective, immediately reacted to the assault on Kalin. Baron viciously defended her, lunging at Yardley and mauling his arm, inflicting the deep wounds that resulted in the extensive scarring. The attack enraged Yardley. The intense pain and the dog's interference fueled a desire for revenge. He saw the fire burning in the fireplace. They had started to warm the cabin. In an act of calculated, horrific cruelty, they forced the injured and terrified dog into the fireplace. They didn't just want to kill the dog, they wanted it to suffer. Baron, desperate to escape the flames, immediately tried to scramble up the chimney shaft. Yardley and Xavier then climbed onto the roof, took the heavy metal chimney cap, and sealed the opening, trapping the dog inside. They ensured the dog burned alive and suffocated as it desperately tried to claw its way upwards, its final moments marked by agony and terror. The horrific death of the dog was both an act of revenge and a twisted offering. With Kalin dead and the dog disposed of, they set about erasing any trace of her presence. They hid her backpack in the crawl space, taking the handgun as a trophy, and removed the cabin's logbook to ensure there was no record of their stay. They then transported Kalin's body back to their farm. Yardley concluded his confession by revealing the location where they had disposed of her body. She was buried in a remote section of their extensive farm property. The confession was complete, horrifying, and provided the closure that Owen Vance had desperately sought for 6 years. Following Deacon Yardley's detailed confession, authorities organized an immediate search of the designated location on the vast farm property. Utilizing cadaver dogs and heavy excavation equipment, the search team focused on the remote area Yardley identified. After several hours, Kalin Quaid's remains were recovered. The discovery finally brought an end to the 6-year mystery of her disappearance, confirming the horrific fate that had befallen her in the remote Montana wilderness. The legal process moved swiftly in the wake of the confession and the recovery of the remains. Deacon Yardley, seeking to avoid the death penalty, pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and aggravated animal cruelty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Xavier maintained his silence throughout the proceedings. He went to trial, his defense attempting to shift the blame entirely onto Yardley. However, the physical evidence recovered from the farm, the matching symbols connecting them to the crime scene, and the testimony provided by Yardley detailing their joint actions were overwhelming. Xavier was found guilty on all counts, and was also sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The resolution of the case provided Owen Vance with the devastating answers he had sought for 6 years. The wilderness had not claimed Kalin. She had fallen victim to a calculated, ritualistic act of violence perpetrated by 2 men who had hidden their dark secrets behind a facade of normalcy. In the aftermath of the convictions, investigators scrutinized the extensive evidence of ritualistic activities found on the farm. Given the organized nature of their practices, the isolation of their property, and the calculated cruelty displayed in the murder of Kalin and the torture of Baron, authorities suspected Yardley and Xavier might be responsible for other murders. However, despite extensive investigation, no evidence was ever found to link them to any other cases. The full extent of their activities remained confined to the isolated farm, their secrets buried along with their victim.